So before we get started, I wanted to apologise for my general absence and the absence of content on the channel over the last 8 weeks or so. Unfortunately, I had a lot of personal, non-YouTube related stuff going on, and then I got COVID, which knocked me out for a good 6 weeks or so. But I'm back now, healthy, and ready to create some mediocre content for you to enjoy. Thanks again for sticking around and waiting while I defeated the Reaper. Now, on with the show. The JRPG can be a hard beast to tame. The genre's common focus on complex or deep systems is often both its greatest strength for fans and its greatest weakness for newcomers. But occasionally, a JRPG comes along that keeps things simple. The Cruel King and the Great Hero isn't trying to reinvent the wheel, immerse its players in deep mechanics, or even create much of a challenge. Instead, the aim was clearly to create a warm and cozy morality tale, which, while not devoid of all issues, particularly when it comes to design and polish, is a great little title for both newcomers to the genre or seasoned veterans looking for something simpler and more relaxing to play between more taxing titles. So pull up a chair, grab a hot beverage and a nice blanket, and let's talk about this little fable and find out what it's all about. Right from its opening moments, it's clear what kind of story the Cruel King and the Great Hero is looking to tell. Its storybook aesthetic, heavy reliance on narration, and fabled tone all evoke the familiar feeling of a bedtime story, and this tone is one that the game continues to lean into throughout. Set in a unique and atmospheric land where monsters and humans both reside, the story revolves around Yu, a young human girl who's being raised by a dragon king after being orphaned at a young age. Seeking to know all about her real parents, Yu is an optimistic and, if I'm honest, adorable protagonist, whose naive lack of cynicism and positive outlook continue to reinforce the game's age-old but well-delivered messages of self-belief, tolerance, and understanding. While some of the narrative can be a little too on the nose, it's nothing that you wouldn't read in many a quality bedtime story, and so it feels in keeping with the general tone of the storytelling. Moreover, the way the game reinforces its tone, narrative, and characters through some of its design and art choices is just wonderful. For example, as Yu goes off on her early adventures towards the start of the game, her guardian, the Dragon King, worries about her, so decides to follow but stay hidden. This means that as you travel through stages or fight foes, you can always see him in the background, hiding in hedges and making sure she's okay. Also, at the start of the game, Yu's weapon is just a stick she found on the ground, and she wears a pot on her head for protection. Like, it's just a regular pot. But probably my favourite touch is that when Yu uses one of her skills in battle, like the Fire Strike, it's actually the Dragon King who's powering her weapons up from his hiding spot, despite her thinking she's doing it herself. Now, while all of this does actually change as the game goes on, and Yu does eventually learn to fight and explore without her adopted father watching over her, the way it's handled is so good that it genuinely feels like a natural progression, as Yu starts to understand her place in this tale and the world as a whole. I don't want to say more, as I genuinely believe that the story, or perhaps more specifically, how the story is told, is the Cruel King and the Great Hero's best quality. And while I'm sure many players will see some of its twists and turns coming a mile off, it's nonetheless a journey worth taking in my opinion. However, while the Cruel King and the Great Hero does do a great job of delivering its story through both its presentation and its design, unfortunately, neither of these elements of the game are perfect. Let's start with design. Gameplay-wise, what we have here is a basic turn-based JRPG, with random battles, skills and abilities, gear, weapons and accessories to equip, and a bunch of varied locations to explore. Continuing the storybook theme, the game is presented in a 2D format, with characters and locations looking like art you might find in an illustrated bedtime fable. Hell, even the random battle animation and transition animations are pages turning. Each area is made up of a group of 2D nodes that are connected on a larger map, with some areas inaccessible until later in the game after unlocking new companions or abilities, but more on those in a bit. Now, pretty soon after you start playing, some of the design decisions become apparent, and while they're not all bad, some are unfortunately convoluted and a little antiquated, leading to some periods of frustration. A good example of this is the game's movement system. The first thing you'll probably notice when you start playing the game is how slow Yu moves. At first, I was like, is there a run button I'm missing or something? Why is she so slow? Turns out that this is intentional, and possibly serves as an analog for how much of the game is designed. You see, when entering a new area, you will only be able to walk. This in turn means that she will have to partake in more random battles. However, after she levels up past the current area's general enemy level and becomes more powerful, she will then be able to run, allowing for faster travel and less time dealing with random encounters. Now, while on paper this is actually an interesting idea, unfortunately its implementation can get in the way of it working as well as it should. For example, this system is not determined by the entire area, only by the individual node of the map in question. This means that you might be able to run for one screen, but not the next 2 or 3 or 4 or so on. Also, even with this system, the encounter rate is exceptionally high in The Cruel King and the Great Hero, feeling akin to those found in older, more hardcore JRPGs from the 90s. Confusingly, this is also the only element that seems to draw from such a hardcore influence, and the combat itself is almost too easy. While there were a few bosses that made me pay attention a little more, the general level of difficulty here is very low, and while this might be good for newcomers to the genre, having a high encounter rate with a low level of battle difficulty is unfortunately a recipe for frustration and tedium. Battles themselves are pretty standard affairs, with turn-based attacks augmented through the use of skills, items, buffs and debuffs, as well as the use of particular pieces of equipment. As previously mentioned, all the systems on show here are pretty standard, and while there are a few interesting abilities that get unlocked in the late game, most battles are not strategic affairs. Buy a lot of health items and use them when your health gets low in battle, as items always trigger before any other attacks. Ignore any debuffs and just keep attacking. This method will basically see you through the entire game, and any of its optional content. What all of this creates is an experience that once again is great for newcomers, if a little laborious, and either fun or tedious for seasoned veterans, depending on what kind of JRPG you like, and how important deep systems are to you, and what you might be in the mood to play in that moment. For me, I saw The Cruel King and the Great Hero as a bit of a respite of sorts, a slow, charming and untaxing way of relaxing between other, more complicated and more difficult games. But again, your mileage may vary, and despite my view, I was still certainly frustrated and a little bored at points. Just know that this is not a hard game, and the combat and leveling progression systems are perfectly functional, but not very deep or challenging. When not in battle or progressing the story, most of your time will be spent taking on side quests, or as they're dubbed in this game, acts of kindness. Completing these will allow you to learn more about the world and its inhabitants, as well as reward you with rare accessories, items, money, and tokens that can be used to unlock some concept art and badges. Now, these were a bit of a mixed bag for me for a few reasons. On the one hand, the writing was often charming and really added to my understanding and connection with the world and its characters. On the other hand, the fetch quest nature of the tasks, coupled with a pretty awful traversal system and the aforementioned high encounter rate, unfortunately caused more than a little frustration. You see, a little ways into the game, you unlock a type of fast travel. However, it might be the most convoluted fast travel system I've ever experienced. So let me try and break it down for you. At some point in the first third of your journey, you unlock the ability to travel between these special fountains that you come across in each area. But in order to do so, you have to find one first. Makes sense so far, right? Well, the first thing you'll notice is that a lot of the maps for various areas are large and only have 1 or maybe 2 fountains at each end, meaning that even if you use them to travel, you still have to run a decent distance to reach your objective. You're also given an item a little ways into the game that will allow you to travel back to the main hub village from anywhere. However, when you spawn there after using it, you're not near the fast travel fountain and have to move a few screens to get to it in order to fast travel again. Now, while this might not seem like much at first, the time running between those 2 screens soon adds up. What all of this means is that sometimes I would fast travel to an area, run to the quest marker, collect the quest item, notice that I needed to be back at the fountain that I just came from, so instead of running all the way back there, the quickest way would be to use the aforementioned item to travel back to the village, run to the fountain in the village a few screens over, travel back to the area I was just in, as that would spawn me near the area's fountain, which would be closer to my goal. Ugh. Do you see what I mean by convoluted? Don't worry if this doesn't completely make sense. Just know that it's a pain in the ass to get pretty much anywhere, and it's a problem that crops up a lot, especially if you're going for 100% completion, due to the sheer number of side quests that unlock throughout the game, almost all of which require a lot of travel. On top of all of this, the map will also occasionally show obstacles that can only be crossed or bested at various points in the story, when you is accompanied by one of several potential companions. The problem here is the icon for such obstacles on the map is just a question mark, which doesn't indicate which companion or ability is needed in order to traverse them. This means that you can travel all the way to a question mark and then realize that you have the wrong companion. This means you'll have to travel back to the village, run to the fountain, travel to the fountain near where you can change companions, run to the required area, change companion, and so on. Are you understanding how frustrating this nonsense is now? Moreover, the aforementioned question mark icon is also used for several other things, like treasure chests or a shortcut, meaning you're never quite sure where to go or who to bring with you. On top of all of this, there seems to be a bug that means that not all icons are disappearing after you solve whatever is there. This means an absolute nightmare for completionists who are trying to clear their map. Now, granted, this bug may have been fixed by the time this review goes live, but if it hasn't, good luck. Finally, regarding the fast travel system, the UI is also a little counterintuitive. Areas are named and can be viewed from either a local or an overworld map. And while this is fine, the fact that when you use fast travel, you only get a list of locations and not the map itself can be a little problematic. For some of the acts of kindness, you're required to visit like 5 different areas. And so trying to memorize which ones you need and which fountain you need in that area can be frustrating, especially when all of this could have been easily alleviated by simply allowing the player to select where they wanted to fast travel to from the map itself, rather than from a list of names. However, while much of this may sound overtly critical, a lot of it is mediated by not only a great story, but also a wonderful art style and stellar presentation. The storybook look here is delivered perfectly, with so much charm and atmosphere that it's indistinguishable from an illustrated bedtime story. Specific shout out to the character designs as well, which are incredible. I mean, look at this little guy. Look at his apron. Look at it! And the music. Oh man, the music. Every area has a distinctive and wonderful track that simultaneously creates atmosphere and serves to immerse the player. It truly is one of the best soundtracks I've heard in a game for a while. On top of this, the narration is well delivered and helps to once again serve the overall tone. It is worth noting on this front though, that the narration is all in Japanese with English text, which to me personally was great and only added to the overall experience, but I know some people might be turned off by the lack of English dub or might struggle with it for various reasons, so I thought it was worth pointing out. However, taken together, all of this really does draw the player into the game's world and naturally cause them to almost unconsciously overlook many of the game's prominent flaws. So let's talk a little bit about performance. I touched on one of the bugs earlier, and unfortunately there are a few more that need mentioning. I tested both the PlayStation 4 and Switch versions during this review process, and while Switch was what I mainly played on, I can say that performance-wise, there doesn't seem to be too much between them. Having said this, there were a few issues that I ran into on Switch later in the game that, while I haven't been able to personally replicate on PlayStation 4 yet, may also occur there. First of all, the game would occasionally freeze in combat. The outcome of this would vary, from a long pause, up to 25 seconds sometimes, to a complete lock forcing a restart. In around the 17 hours it took me to beat the Cruel King and the Great Hero, I saw this occur maybe 4 or 5 times, and it seemed to be a little more frequent later in the game. Fortunately, there is a quick save system that can be used at any time, the player has the ability to make a full save at any time, and the game also auto-saves regularly, meaning that whenever this happened, I never really lost any real progress. Second, I experienced several UI issues on top of the aforementioned map marker bug, which includes menus occasionally not functioning, and shops only letting me buy a certain number of items at once for no reason. Luckily, closing the menu in question and then reopening it seemed to fix this, but it's still a little bit weird. On top of all of this, there was also pretty significant text overflow issues, where dialogue would run outside of speech bubbles during some of the game's more pivotal boss fights. Now, I won't show them here because of spoilers, and while this is nothing major, it did occasionally make dialogue hard to read and also take me out of the moment. I also had an issue where the final act of kindness never triggered for me, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, but yeah, that really sucked. Finally, I did notice some performance drops in 1 or 2 later game areas that, while a little distracting, never really hindered gameplay. Now, it's worth noting that I played this game before its release, and therefore before any possible day 1 patch. I'm not sure if such a thing is being planned, but if so, it could be that many of these issues are fixed by the time the game actually comes out. But just in case, I thought it best to mention all of them. Also, aside from these issues, it's worth noting that the game does run super well and has really good loading times, which was particularly welcome. When it comes to replay value, there is unfortunately not too much on offer. As mentioned before, the game took me around 17 hours to basically 100%, barring the final side mission, which for some reason just won't trigger. I don't know if this is definitely a bug or something I did, but given that I was always completing all acts of kindness as they became available before moving on to the next story section, I don't know how I could have messed this up. Either way, this also stopped me from getting the final unlockables. So while I beat everything else in the game, the completionist in me is still losing sleep over this one, to be honest. There isn't any New Game Plus mode or higher difficulties to tackle, so really this is a one and done affair at worst, and a game you will replay occasionally at best. While I get why there isn't anything else after the credits roll given the game's positioning as a story to be experienced rather than a set of challenges to be overcome, the lack of any extra content or replay value is still a bit of a shame. So when you put all of this together, what you're left with is a really fun, well-told tale for any who are new to the genre or are looking for a nice, lower-key, shorter and less complicated, story-driven JRPG to play. The world, characters and art style are fantastic, and the tale told, while a little predictable, is one that serves to charm the player throughout. While some of its design decisions and its lack of polish in a few areas mean that trying to do everything on offer here makes for a frustrating experience in a lot of ways, those who simply play the story and only indulge a little in the side content are sure to have a great time. It is a bit slow, and it's a journey that perhaps you'll only take once. But if you like JRPGs, morality tales, or fabled bedtime stories, or you're looking for a less taxing and more relaxing example of the genre, The Cruel King and the Great Hero is definitely a journey worth taking. Thank you all for watching, and thanks again to NIS America for hooking me up with some review codes for this game. If you liked the video, then make sure to subscribe, share, and ring the notification bell so you never miss any new content. And if you like JRPGs, then stick around, there's a lot more to come, including my attempt to review every single JRPG released in the West on PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, which, now I think about it, might be a terrible idea that also sends me mad. Still, should be funny to watch.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.